Welcome to Repeatable Revenue, a show for online entrepreneurs, remote business builders, and those that are aspiring to be. I'm your host, Ray Green, and on this podcast, I'm going to share everything that I've learned and am learning about building my online business from a remote Mexican beach. Hey, welcome to the show. And today I'm really excited to introduce Bob Perkins. Bob is a very good friend of mine. He's a mentor and he's been an advisor to me across different companies. He has spent his entire career selling stuff to people. Sometimes that's been political ideas. Sometimes it's been fashion. Sometimes it's been pizza. But the bulk of his career has been creating structures, creating strategies to effectively and efficiently sell stuff to people, and doing that by taking a holistic look at the business and the organizations that he's working with. He's been a senior marketing executive and CMO at household names like Playboy, Pizza Hut, Calvin Klein. He's been a founder and mentor to many startups, and he's been an advisor to several of the most influential people in Washington, D.C. And I'm really excited to bring his ideas, his thought process, and some of his perspectives to you. So without further ado, let's dive in. Welcome back to the show, Bob.
Thank you.
Glad to have you. Now, how do you introduce yourself? Like, you're a marketer, you're a consultant, you're an advisor, how do you introduce yourself typically? I'm Bob and I do
Violate Ray Green's first rule. And Ray's first rule is have a target audience that knows in the first 5 seconds whether you can solve their problem. But since I almost always introduce myself to somebody who I know a little bit about, I try to sort of fold it to say, hey, I have a lot of experience solving problems in the area of, and then fill in whether it's marketing or strategy or whatever. So I started a little bit, but if you said, give me the 2 sentence, people retain me to solve a specific problem. I'm usually not retained to help out some pie in the sky, or we're writing our 5-year plan. We need somebody to help us. We launched this new product and it's fallen on its face, and what should we do? And we don't want to spend a lot of money and hire somebody else, so we'll spend a little money and hire you. That's how I think of myself.
Cool. Yeah, I never know. We've worked together for so long, and I don't know how I would necessarily introduce you, but you're the guy I call with virtually any type of business. But it can be strategy, it can be different industries, it can be leadership. You've always got a unique look on it. So it varies quite a bit. But hey, let's jump in. I want to start actually drawing on that. So you have, in my view, like a really unique background. You've been president of Chiat Day, New York's office, right? Worked with clients like Apple and Michael Dell and Nike in advertising. You've been an advisor to like top of the most like 100 most influential people in Washington. I know you've advised some of them. We know some of the same people. And you've sat in the C-suite and in senior offices of Pizza Hut, Calvin Klein, Playboy, others. So you have this like very unique background, and you've worked with a lot of high performers across those different disciplines. And so I'm curious, what, if any, like patterns or actions or traits have you seen with the high performers that you've worked in those areas that someone like me, like your average Joe, I could look at that and say, these are behaviors or actions or something that I can learn that are going to improve my chances of wild success. Are there any consistencies or patterns or anything that somebody like me could take from that and do something with?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, the best CEO I ever worked for was Steve Reineman, who was CEO of Pizza Hut. And Steve and I disagreed about a lot of things, but we agreed that he was a great CEO. But Steve's principal claim to fame was he avoided rethinking problems he thought he had solved until they had data to the contrary. So you get a big organization, you have a lot of opinions. If you're the head of marketing, which I was at Pizza Hut, no matter how well it goes, it could have gone better. No matter how well it goes, you could have spent less. There's always lots of ways to throw stones at it. And even though we were very successful and made all of our numbers, Steve had a rule. Once we made a decision, we don't revisit it unless we have new data. And that made my job possible. It really did. And I did some stupid stuff and I did some smart stuff because nobody's perfect. But the truth is, the bigger the organization, the more important consistent management is. Now, Steve always had a great argument, a great debate beforehand. Everybody got to say their piece, but it was sort of a wedding. Speak now or forever hold your mouth. And many's the time the executive committee would all agree I should go do something, and then I'd go do it, and everybody'd come back to the next executive committee moaning and groaning, and Ryan would say, anybody have new data? Then shut up. And I so love that because it's so easy. People talk about responding to new information and being nimble and quick and all that kind of stuff, which is very important. I'll talk about that in a second. But I think it's easier to think you're being nimble than it is to be consistent, and being consistent is more important. More people were killed by nimbleness than were killed by consistency. So if you had, and Steve was, you got new data, then I want to talk about it, obviously. So consistent, thoughtful application of decision making and sticking with it, consistency is very important. The second thing, I think and this is Jay Chiat of Chiat Dave to amplify this. Jay had a vision that he really cared about. And if you bought into that vision, he loved you. And if you didn't, he fired you. And many people came to Jay and said, gee, Jay, if you did it this way, you'd make more money. And Jay said, my goal in life is not to make more money. My goal in life is to have the best advertising agency in the world. He had this great phrase, I want to see how big we can get before we get bad. Funny, but the T-shirt at Chiat Day was good enough is not enough. And I think leaders that have clear visions make life for everybody else much easier because everybody understands where they're headed. When I ran the New York office, you'd go to a client and the client would say, well, I really want this. And basically you'd say, we don't do that. And the client would say, well, I'm going to fire you. And you'd go, fine, that's your business. You obviously tried to talk him out of it. But at the end of the day, as somebody who wasn't in charge, you knew what the person in charge wanted. And therefore, when you had an opportunity to do something, you did it. And when somebody said absolutely not, you argued with them. But the whole organization had a focus and a bias to it, which was really great.
Where does a vision, because what I heard when you talk about Reinemann is there's built-in decisiveness, right? Like there's a decision-making model that says, hey, we've made a decision. We're going to fight before we do this. We're going to make a decision, and then we're not going to revisit unless there's new data. And so it's kind of take that as a decision-making model. Combine that with decisiveness with the strong vision that you mentioned. Where does that, I talk to a lot of people that have visions, but they change it all the time. Like it's not deep. There's no conviction. It's not deep. Like they have a vision and then 3 weeks later, it's a new vision. And 3 weeks later, it's a new vision. What's the difference, do you think?
I think the vision influences the decision-making process. But I'll give you a great example. So I was at Chiat Day. This is before I ran the New York office. I was in LA and I sold a full-page print ad to our largest client. And they loved the whole thing. And it was a very bold ad. It was very out there, except that the headline ended with the period. And the CEO of the company was a grammarian at heart and hated the period and wanted it gone. And I said, sure, fine. What do I care? We're not changing the words. We're not changing the layout. We're not changing the typeface. Jay had a heart attack. Your job is not to get rid of periods. Your job is to get rid of clients that don't want periods, to paraphrase Jay in language suitable for a public broadcasting. Vision requires the willingness to lose a piece of business or money. All visions are great until somebody says, come to you, you can either have your vision or you can have $1 million. And most people say, I'll take the $1 million. So they don't really have a vision. They had a convenient idea as long as it worked, but the minute it didn't work, then they're on to something else. The old story about, I think they made a movie out of this with Woody Harrelson about Is your wife a prostitute? No. Would she sleep with me for $1 million? Yes. We're just arguing about price. I think that's a good example of people thinking they have a vision, but not really being committed to it. And another guy worked for Calvin Klein, and Mr. Klein, this is a great Calvin Klein story, but this is vision. We're making a new brand, a new kind of suit, a new super expensive suit. And it just so happens that the fit model was a 44 long, and that happened to be my size. And the fit model couldn't come to a fitting, so Mr. Klein said, Bob, put the suit on, we'll start with you. So we put the suit on, and he said, finally, he said, okay, Bob, what do you think? I said, well, Mr. Klein, I won't use all the jargon, but essentially the waist of this is a 34 waist, and I think it should be a 35 waist because I'm in pretty good shape and I'm a 35 waist and I'm a 44 long. And he looked at me and said, Bob, I don't want people with a 35-inch waist wearing this suit. That's a vision that is not driven by, I want to be the biggest, I want to sell more suits than anybody else in America, which is a different kind of vision. That was Linda Wachner's vision about bras and panties. It led to a different set of decision-making. She was equally great at holding her own ground at what she wanted. Mr. Klein was equally great at holding ground at what he wanted, but they were willing to make sacrifices to support their vision. And that's how you know whether you have a vision or not. Mm. And people that aren't willing to make sacrifices don't have a vision. They just have a convenient way of doing something until it doesn't work.
You've worked with, you've named a few of them, like really high performers, but across a lot of different disciplines. And I'm curious, one book that you recommended to me a long time ago that I love is Competing Against Luck. And I think it's kind of a controversial subject to a degree. What role does luck play on across many disciplines, wildly successful people? What portion of that is driven by luck, and what portion of that, from your experience, is driven by deliberate actions that people are taking to move towards their vision?
I think interesting question. I've mulled that over in my own mind many times. I think the way I like to think about it is luck plays a larger part than we like to admit, but we should never admit it. The minute let's just say I said it's 80-20, 80% work and 20% luck, which is probably pretty close to what I believe, by the way. Every time you fail, you say, well, it just wasn't lucky. But a lot of people succeeded. So it's the 80% of work you did that wasn't right, not the lack of luck. So I think luck's important. Luck plays a role in stuff, but the minute you use it as an excuse, you're missing the joke. The joke is you got to plan to be successful without luck, and if you get luck, super, and if you don't get luck, you still ought to be successful. But funny, a friend of mine asked me to teach a college class, and they wanted an example of good marketing and bad marketing. And they were thinking back to my shy days. So I picked the launch of Emerald Cars, the National Car Rentals Emerald Isle, which was the first time you could skip the counter and go straight to the car. And we did that when I was at Chiat Day. It was my little project along with the CEO of National, wildly successful. And that it was wildly successful because the CEO was willing to overrule the lawyers. The way it failed was we never anticipated once our lawyers roll over and play dead, and once we've done it for a month and the world has not come to an end and 42 people haven't driven off the lot and never come back with their cars, every other car rental company in the country is going to do it immediately too, and they're bigger than we are and more successful than we are, and they're going to overwhelm us. And now most people think Hertz invented the idea. Yeah. You can say, well, guys, we're lucky you came to it first. No, we weren't. You can say you were unlucky Hertz did a bigger thing. Well, that's not luck. That's bad thinking on our part. We should have been building the moat a lot earlier. So I think luck's important, but I don't think you should ever count on it or use it as an excuse.
Kind of makes me, as I spend the better part of my early years in sales, it's the same argument with leads, like quality of leads, right? Yeah, sometimes I get like a low-hanging fruit. Sometimes the leads matter. But consistent, sustained top performance over time isn't explained by leads, but it's a factor. Like you can't ignore it, but it's an excuse if you focus on it too much.
Yeah. And I think one, to change subjects, but in a slightly different way, if you said one of the most difficult things to do, the Army, after they have a battle, they have what they call an after attack. And but
After action review or something.
Yeah, businesses hate to have that. Nobody in a business likes to sit around, and particularly if you're a sole entrepreneur and you have a couple of pitches that don't work, you hate to sit around and say, now, what have I done wrong? It's easy to say they were jerks, they didn't listen, they didn't give me the right. I mean, lots of reasons, all of which come out of some sense of reality. It's not like you're making this stuff up, but really sitting down and looking, saying, what did I do wrong? Or to put it slightly more positive, what could have I done better? Is the most underrated skill in business, in my opinion. Because, Ray, that I love the book, The Lean Startup by Eric and Reese. And Eric Reese calls startups learning machines. But even he doesn't do as good a job as he could. And it's a great book, and he's a smart dude. So this is not criticism. Of saying, when you fail, you should learn something from it. And launching a new product, if I don't like it, okay, I need to think about that, but I'm doing my same thing every day. I know how to do it. I should just leave it like it is. The golf course I belong to was designed by Gary Player, and Gary Player comes once a year and looks at his handiwork. So I was talking to Mr. Player one day. We're talking about bunker shots. And he said, we try to do 100 bunker shots a day. I said, wow, that's a lot of bunker shots. He said, well, I do 50, and then I keep going until I sink one. I said, well, what if you've done another 50 and you haven't sunk one? He said, what don't you understand? I stay until I sink one. I thought, oh, yeah, I got that. There's a guy dedicated, who's very, very good, who's dedicated to getting better. And he hits a bunker shot and says, oh, I did this wrong, I did that wrong. Constantly learning. And the beauty thing about a bunker shot is you get great feedback. Mm-hmm. You see where you hit the sand, you see where the ball went, you see where it ended up. One of the most important things of learning is feedback. And one of the problems of doing after attack analysis in the business world is you don't have all the immediate feedback you'd like. But I think that if somebody said, what's a skill that every entrepreneur should develop that they probably don't have enough, that would be my first one. Learn from your mistakes. Just don't go, God damn, that's unfair, and I'm moving on.
Yeah. And you actually said that when talking about high performers that you've seen across many disciplines. I think one of the first things you actually said was don't repeat the same mistake, learn from the mistakes. And one thing that I have found over the last couple of years is, as doing solopreneur stuff, is having a decision-making filter on the front end, like something that says, I'm going to make this decision. Here's what I'm expecting to have happen. Here's what a win looks like. Here's what a loss looks like. Having that before I make some key decisions makes it a lot easier when something doesn't go well to go back and look at, all right, what did I expect from this? And determine, all right, was it a win? Was it not? And if not, what did I learn from it? And so I've found like the process you go into decision making probably heavily influences whether you're actually going to learn from the lesson, learn the lesson that you should if it doesn't go the way you want it to.
Yeah. Have you clarified your objectives? Mr. Player said my objectives is either he did or he didn't. It's very bimodal. But if he just went, well, I want to get a couple very close, then how do you know if you succeed? So I think you're absolutely right. Making sure your expectations are well set going in. I just, in the process of finishing a little project that went very well and everybody's happy, but I realized that I had a different set of, what I wanted was X and what the client wanted was C. The client got C and they're ecstatic, and I'm scratching my head saying, gee, I wanted X. And then I realized that was my goal, but that wasn't the client's. When I sat down, what was my goal? To make the client happy. I just didn't spend enough time figuring out what would really make them happy. Eventually we got. So I think you're right that that a good decision-making process has and it's all about resource allocation, which we'll come to in a second, but has here's what I expect, here's what I did, here's what I got, what can I learn from that?
Yep.
And that's a process that, in my opinion, breaks down often at the end.
Yep.
What did I learn from that? I'm too busy to think about that because it's painful. It ain't fun.
No, but it's how you avoid doing it again, which is you don't want Groundhog's Day in your business.
Or how you get better at it, because most mistakes, there are all kinds of mistakes, but most mistakes in the consulting business aren't, I said do X and I should have said Y. And so the next time you come to that situation, it's, I didn't explain it the right way. I didn't use the right language. I didn't think about it. It's more of a cacophony of errors, not just I was going 60 in a 55 zone and I got a ticket, so I'll never go 60 in a 55 zone. That's very black and white. Usually it's mistakes in our businesses aren't like that.
No, not when you're solving complicated, complex problems.
Yeah.
Something we talked about last time, Bob, was that really resonated with me, the takeaway, and I know other people that heard it. And it was the conversation we had about the essence of strategy. And I can't remember if it was Drucker or Porter, but I think you said the essence of strategy is denial. Like it's saying no to things. And we know that as entrepreneurs or even executives, we know intuitively that there are always going to be more ideas than we have capacity to execute. There are always going to be more things we want to do than resources to go after. And we know we've got to let some fires burn. We can't do everything and we can't do it really well. But I see this being, like with a lot of the entrepreneurs that I coach, I see this being the source of failure for a lot of people. And it's the inability to prioritize, the inability to say, I understand that has some urgency or that's important, but we have to let that fire burn in order to focus on the bigger priority. Like that trade-off is a difficult thing, and people end up getting diluted trying to chase them all, trying to do it all. And just revisiting that, I'm curious, like, why do you think it's so hard for entrepreneurs?